Please welcome back Landon Derentz.
It's great to be here. It's great to be back on stage, and for the devoted few, it's good to see you here as we take a moment to engage on crisis and change energy after the shock. For those familiar with the Global Energy Forum, in Abu Dhabi, we used to do a night owl, and the night owl was we'd come back after our long dinners and maybe a glass of wine, get a glass of bourbon and chat. And this is my version, as close as I can get, and maybe I'll bring back night owls in the future.
Is there bourbon?
I was going to say.
I might be able to pull some bourbon up. But well, you guys know my two guests here. I'm really excited to be joined by Jigar Shah, host of Energy Empire and Open Circuit, and of course Bob McNally, founder and president of Rapidan Energy. Also both friends and longtime advisors and thinkers on energy. And what's special about this discussion is it's really, we're calling it Bob McNally on change, right? We get, it's like we get your band up here, we'll get the energy going.
That's right.
And the reality is we want to deep dive some of the theses about the impacts that you've heard about so consistently throughout the day. And starting off this morning with Sheikh Nawaf and debating, how big is this global crisis and what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz? We've experienced quite a disruptive energy security environment over the last 5 years. You think about COVID in one direction, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and then of course now this war in Iran causing quite massive chaos. But is it really, Bob, is it really the scalable, biggest crisis since World War II?
Well, first of all, congratulations, Landon, for a fantastic conference. And thank you all for sticking it out at the very end here. No, I think it's undeniably the largest disruption in energy history since World War II, or any time for which we have records. Interestingly, in terms of percentage of oil disrupted, the biggest disruption before this was actually the Suez crisis of 1956-57. And one reason we don't remember that or talk about that as a traumatic energy event is back then when we lost about 10% of global supply, it was a much smaller market. The United States, which was OPEC back then, the Texas Railroad Commission, had about a third of global oil production in spare, and it was all outside the Suez crisis. Well, not only do we have now a bigger disruption, 15% or so of oil, 20% of LNG, but all of the spare capacity, that mother of all shock absorbers, if you will, is inside the Gulf, as Sheikh Nawaf knows so well, and therefore unavailable. So biggest disruption, no spare, compared to the last one, which was biggest disruption with lots of spare. But I think more importantly than the volume lost is, I think, unfortunately, a load-bearing assumption in energy and even broader economics has been toppled as a result of this. And it's specifically that the United States would allow an adversary to effectively shut down the flow of commodities from Hormuz for more than a couple days, let alone 3 months. That idea was not just a low probability, high impact idea. I would argue that with very scant exceptions, nobody had even remotely questioned the idea that the United States would guarantee the free flow of carbons. The Carter Doctrine, really the Reagan corollary, stood firm just like the dollar gold peg from the early 30s until 1971. Or the idea that the Federal Reserve would not allow a systemically important bank to fail until 2008. An idea so foundational to ordering of our understanding of energy flows in industry, it wasn't even questioned. It was literally unthinkable. And that is gone. And that will not come back. And that is a lot of toothpaste to squeeze back into the tube.
Bob, translate that into plain English for me. What does that translate to? If we're giving up the Carter Doctrine, does that mean this is a long-term new structural reality for the Strait of Hormuz? Iran has
It's not just the Strait of Hormuz, and it's not just about building pipelines around the Strait of Hormuz. It's about, the industry talks about below-ground risks, technology risks, and above-ground risks, policy and geopolitics. The Carter Doctrine and its Reagan corollary stood as sort of a factor that almost prevented investors and industry from perceiving a structural risk to energy production and flows in that region. And the U.S. backstopped it. We had 2 wars, won in a matter of days. During the tanker war, they never shut Hormuz. And when the last time we shot at the Iranians, Operation Praying Mantis, we sank 1/3 of their navy in an afternoon. So we demonstrated there's no need to be worried about, not the Strait of Hormuz, regional production and flows. That is gone. That means that investors, especially in hydrocarbons, are going to look at that region and see a structural security risk they never imagined before.
Well, it's not just investors, Jigar. You know, when you and I were talking about this early on in the conflict, it was actually where the genesis of this idea came of getting us all on stage, because you were talking about off-takers having real-world consequences and immediate change in terms of their thinking and their acquisitions and procurement of energy. There's congruence here that we know everybody wants to have energy access and affordable, reliable supply. The question is, where are they getting it from? And what are you seeing on the ground? One, do you agree with Bob's thesis that this is a structural reality in terms of the area, the region of the Middle East is more vulnerable and susceptible? And two, is that going to lead to long-term change in terms of how off-takers are dealing with their energy security? Well,
I mean, my doctrine is never to disagree with Bob. So I will always agree with Bob.
We'll push throughout the series to see if that works.
Let's get the bourbon
agree.
out here.
Look, I think that, you know, as somebody who has worked his entire career around taking energy technology, right, a lot of which Bob was centrally involved in, you know, the energy, plans that Dick Cheney put together and that, you know, George W. Bush put together, et cetera. And then we spent the last 25 plus years implementing a lot of those plans, right? Those technologies are now ready for prime time, whether it's like nuclear, or electric vehicles, or solar and wind, or battery storage, or all those other things, right? And what we were waiting for was an offtake, right? Because a lot of these countries were basically saying, do I need to do this? I don't know. Like, oil prices might fall, natural gas prices might fall. I might have this, I might have that. I'll do this. Today, we're signing up contracts like every minute of every day, right? Every single minister of energy in the entire world that is in charge of importing fossil fuels is now saying that my job is to reduce the importation of fossil fuels, right? That money, that hard currency, that the fact that we have to use our US dollars or our euros or whatever it is to like actually buy that stuff, right, is our investment pool, right? If I can figure out a way to license nuclear power and build it in country, I will. If I can figure out how to like do geothermal, I will. If I can figure out how to do electric vehicles, I will. Now, not all of it can be done, right? Plastics, right? Like there's all these things that oil and gas like do, and particularly on the chemical side. But I would suggest to you that in Asia, where I work extensively, there's not a single person looking at LNG for power, right? Every single person now who is thinking about LNG for power has canceled that contract and is now saying, we're going to burn more coal, or we're going to do electric, we're going to do solar, wind.
You said somewhere
nuclear.
around 60 countries?
Yeah, about 60 countries are like very large energy importers, right? And every one of them is trading notes now around how to do this. What is the contract structure you're using? What about that, that IFC best practices document we ignored from 7 years ago? Let's pull that out and see if we can write that up again. And so as a result, you're in a place where people are actually transacting in a way that I've literally never seen before, right? I mean, just the amount of transactions that are occurring. And then on top of that, what you find is that while China has a lot of equipment, right, and they manufacture a lot of equipment, they have very little know-how, and they don't want to share any know-how they might have in these 60 countries. So all the integration work, all of the work around software for electric utility companies, all of the work around, figuring out how to build a microgrid, maximize revenue streams, all of that is American and some European firms.
So, Bob, I guess a question on this one, and a mistake I think a lot of policymakers is they don't think about the temporal element. And so I'll ask you a question about the thesis Jigar has, but broadly, how long do we live in this pressure point? Because the longer this lasts, the more that reality becomes effectively built in. And so a question about demand destruction. Are we seeing the oil market decline, or is this going to be flat and placid?
Yeah, there's a fascinating debate that has popped up as the result of this war and the price spike, and it sort of goes along the lines, will the biggest disruption in history and the spike in oil and gas prices do, let's say, what the Paris Agreement and associated subsidies and mandates maybe we can't do or wouldn't do, is to accelerate transportation, the electrification of transportation, to achieve, and we use our words very carefully, demand destruction, the permanent long-term destruction of demand, in this case oil and transportation. And I think the way to think about that is to think about the last time we saw that and what caused it. The last time we saw demand destruction was in the 1970s. Back in the early 1970s, over 40% of OECD oil demand was fuel oil, heavy, gunky, residual fuel we were using for electricity generation, space heating, industrial uses. And then two things happened in the 1970s that don't exist now. One is oil prices quadrupled permanently. People talk about the Arab oil embargo in 1973, nothing burger. The loss of supply, short-lived. What really happened in the fourth quarter of 1973 is OPEC came in, and back then we were just fixing oil prices or posting them. There wasn't market determined. They came in at $3 a barrel, and by Christmas, it was $12 a barrel, and it was permanent. Imagine our demand curve for EVs if we all knew with certainty the price of gasoline was going to be $12 a gallon for the foreseeable future. Jigar and I'd be
So
out.
when does it allay, though?
So that's the first thing is everybody saw it. And the second thing, and these are both necessary, you need the price increase that's permanent. And then we had scalable alternatives to fuel oil that weren't controlled by the Chinese or posed other geopolitical risks: coal, gas, nuclear, even renewables. And so we quickly swapped that heavy fuel oil out of electricity generation and found cheaper, safer, better ways to generate electricity. And fuel oil demand, I think, is about 3 or 4% of OECD demand. That's demand destruction. Here, I don't believe EVs, Chinese-dominated cheap EV supply chains, are to gasoline and diesel what coal, gas, nuclear, and renewables were to fuel oil back then, and I'm certain we're not going to get a permanent...
Because they're not drop-in, because it takes time.
Takes time.
Incremental.
Takes time. And it can't be forced, I think, by government policies. I think revolutions in energy are driven by innovation, technological innovation. The private sector, the government sector has often very little to do with it. There's exceptions, like France after World War II said, we're going nuclear. There are exceptions, but they're to the rule.
So in private meetings, though, I have a lot of conversations where people are like, oh yeah, it's $95 a Brent to TI, but in real life, it's $160 delivered, right? And if you think about where we started let's just call it the new year, we're at $55, $60 oil. We're pushing a 3x. We're a 3x in price in terms of a barrel on the real delivered price and value.
Right.
It's not 4, okay, fine. But like if that is enduring, if we have an enduring price, what are we going to see the price go to, and how long is that going to last?
Well, that's the question, and I think, we've been on Space Mountain roller coaster ride here for 2 decades. This is not our first oil price boom. And I think investors and oil companies, certainly you see this in the shale patch, where you see a reticence to go run and hire expensive workers and rigs and start drilling, because they know now what goes up can go down. Booms are often undone by busts. They engender their own undoing by hurting demand, hurting economic growth, and encouraging alternative supply. So I think most now the oil companies have learned that we may go to 100, we may go to 150, we may go to 175, but we don't stay there. More likely, you'll see a echo of 2008, where the oil price spike, and I think one thing, and this is a rare thing, I mean, usually oil analysts are a fractious bunch with vibrant debates about where things are going. I've never seen in 35 years where just about every oil analyst I know is predicting a catastrophe. I see some in the audience here this summer. And if we're right, oil prices will go nonlinear. and as they have in the past, sort of detonate fragilities elsewhere in the macroeconomy and financial system, and that ends poorly, often with recessions. And then the oil price collapses. So, Landon, I just don't think we're going to see a permanently higher oil price.
But the argument that we're making here is different, right? I feel like we've gotten off on a tangent because we're talking about something that's on the demand-supply curve. That's not what I'm arguing, right? What I'm arguing is that every single energy minister's job is not only to achieve the lowest possible energy costs for their economy. Their job is national security, energy security, diversification, all of those things, right? The reason why Ethiopia has banned the importation of gasoline and diesel is that they were using hard currency they didn't think they had to afford to buy gasoline and diesel. And so they were like, we're just going to, ban the importation of internal combustion engine cars. And this was beforehand just because they had all the extra hydropower. And they were like, this is great. We're going to move to electric vehicles, right? So my point is less about that piece. And I think Bob's exactly right. Like the notion that we're going to within a very short period of time, get rid of 80% of gasoline demand is ridiculous. But the point is that those 60 energy ministers, they are now forever scarred by this in the way Bob was suggesting with the Carter Doctrine, right? And the Reagan corollary. That, I think they are all in every one of their scenario planning situations are going, I remember 2026. I remember how this thing worked. And now, if I'm going to have to spend $20 billion to build an entire natural gas pipeline infrastructure to take LNG imports and actually pump it all the way into the center of the country, I'm not going to do that because that's a 55-year investment. And I'm going to instead do this, this, and this, right? And so I just think that on the margins, and those margins are very large. I mean, just to put them in perspective for you, last year, right, 100% of all electricity load growth in the entire world was solar, wind, nuclear, right? That all the new coal plants that we built, all the new natural gas plants we built were fully offset by retiring coal plants and natural gas plants. And we expect that to be the case this year, even with the Strait of Hormuz, and next year, and the year after that, right? And so I think when you think about what we've done to destabilize the dominant position of these companies and their fuels, right, in the minds of these energy ministers, you now have a really easy way of giving this presentation and getting your next contract.
So the policymaker's primary driver is energy security.
I think it should be. I mean, he's the man who's actually done that work,
okay.
not me.
But how are you defining energy security? You're advising a minister of said country, let's just call it in Central Asia or South Asia.
Yeah.
What does energy security look like?
Well, in a word, diversity. Diversity, diversity, diversity. And it could be within fuels, where you have fuel switching. You say, whoops, LNG was maybe, if you're in Asia, maybe a bad bet. We just lost one of the two 20% suppliers in Ras Laffan, and that's a hard one to fix. Unless that region turns into a West Europe post-World War II and it's shiny, happy people holding hands. Otherwise, that is a dangerous region without a Carter Doctrine. I'm going to look to alternatives, whether it's renewables, coal, or hydrocarbons in the Americas. I do think wherever your Asian demand curve was for American North and South, hydrocarbons on February 27th, it is now shifted far to the right after this. And I think Asia is going to come to Canada and Alaska and the US and the Caribbean with a renewed willingness and open checkbook to invest in projects, but diversity.
So choke point free supply lines.
That's right. Choke point, and again, when you talk about choke point, it's ex-Middle East. The choke point, you can hit Yambu. The choke point workarounds can be hit by these precision-guided weapons and missiles. It's the presence of a hostile Iran. I think it really all boils down to the Iranian regime, if decapitated as it is, if it survives intact, and we're dealing with a battered and bruised but dug in, defiant, and arguably victorious Iranian regime with Israel and the GCC there, having proven they're able and willing, often with low-cost options, to bring the world's energy and urea and industrial inputs jugular to a close, and the U.S. couldn't stop it?
Jigar, I think that you probably have a different definition of energy security in this case. Like, we're agreeing that energy security is a priority, or should be a priority.
I don't know that I have a different definition as much as I would suggest that there's a different dimension to diversity than what Bob mentioned, right? The other dimension to diversity is the onshoring and reshoring into the United States of America, right? When you think about the fact that we're moving into an AI robots world, so there's no worry about the cost of human labor, the cost of all these other things, right? What you care about is input cost. And the lowest input costs in the world right now are in the United States of America, right? And so my sense is that you're going to see, I'm going to the Reindustrialize conference June 16th and 17th, and all of my friends that are there are investing heavily into the United States of America. We're getting so much additional industrial capacity being built here that in the past we were thinking we were just going to,
Not because of cheap gas.
Not just because of cheap gas, but also because of, the fact that all of this technology was invented here, right? And we were told, right, here's my guy in Shanghai, go there and he'll set you up and do this thing, whatever else. And now they're like, I don't know if I want to go with the guy in Shanghai. I want to go here, and maybe it's 5% more expensive right now. I mean, this is why there's a little bit of frustration with the fact that it's not easy to get a loan out of the loan program's office anymore. It's not easy to navigate all of the rules to get a contract with the Department of War, or this or that or whatever else. But I think that'll get resolved at some point. But I think one of the other areas of diversification is that a lot of these countries who thought that American technology was just going to go hunting for sites in Malaysia or Vietnam or Cambodia or the places, they may not be. They might actually be doing stuff right here.
We've spent a little bit of time talking about net importers of energy. But let's talk about energy security from a net exporter's perspective. Bob, you spend a lot of time in the Middle East. I'm sure that you and I will run into each other at a conference in the region at some point soon. And they have a different thesis here, right? They're saying we're going to have to, it is existential that I produce these hydrocarbons to get them to market. What does it mean under your new framework for the volatility of the region for these countries to have energy security?
Yeah. Well, again, they have their work cut out for them. In my view, it fundamentally comes down to a need to create geopolitical stability in that region. And I don't know how to do it. I have my colleague here, Scott Modell, who's a former CIA field officer, an Iran expert, and a Farsi speaker. He's forgotten everything I'll know, more than I'll know, about the region. But,
very good set of skills to have in this moment.
Well, that's what you need. If you think about just stepping back, World War II was the third in a series of devastating wars that centered around the problem of sort of incorporating a unified Germany, which is into Europe with other great powers there. Now, the Middle East is very different, but you had to have the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, the Second World War, done. That was destructive enough, and Europe said, we've got to solve our problems, peacefully. And I think the Middle East has to get there. Otherwise, again, with the weapons we have, with the failure of the United States to uphold the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan Corollary, and questions about our long-term commitment to stabilize that region, I think energy security, a fundamental requirement is geopolitical stability, and that requires dealing with the regime in Iran.
Can I just add one more thing
Please.
on this? Is that I think one of the things that I find fascinating about these conversations is that we talk about these things in macro terms, but my life is based on working with the thousands of change makers who are the ones who are taking an enormous amount of risk, right? They're the ones who've bet their fortunes, bet their houses, bet whatever it is they have to make their dreams come true. And the amount of energy on that side of the ledger right now is way higher than the side of the ledger that's trying to reduce risk that Bob's talking about, right? The folks who are coming to Detroit are all billion-dollar companies, right? And they are all betting the farm, even as billion-dollar companies, to figure out how to bring energy into Kenya, to figure out how to bring energy into Nigeria, even knowing that there's diesel mafia bosses all over the place. They're like, screw it, we're going in and we're going to try to figure it out, right? When you think about the amount of just raw, confidence and, stupidity, right, that's on this side of the ledger, they're doing it. They're going to all these countries, and they're not going to get stopped.
That would exist irrespective of the current crisis.
Right, but now they're getting contracts faster. It used to be they had to go like 20 times to convince the energy minister to give them a contract. Now on the third trip, the contracts are getting signed, right? Because they're like, you're going to invest how much money into our country? And what do we have to do for that? Okay, we'll give you an electricity permit, and we're going to get that done in a way that you couldn't get before.
So let me build on your prior role at LPO, the Loan Programs Office at DOE, and thinking about capital flows in the current environment. Are you seeing a structural change in terms of how dollars are going to be allocated now, or is it just going to increase the speed and scale in which they're deployed?
It's not a structural change, right? Because remember, the oil and gas industry broadly has moved away from dedicated dollars a long time ago, right? Like so that was true like when you had the fracking boom in 2009 to 2012. But today, all of that has been absorbed into the majors, right? And so their money is Wall Street money. It's like people who invest in equity, people who invest in the S&P 500, people who invest in things. I own, I'm sure, a lot of oil company stock, right? And then they get debt from people who invest in an investment grade credit off-taker, right? And so in general, that money, like it's not like the venture capital that we're going at. Like if you go after to Mark Andreessen at A16Z, he's not really investing in the oil and gas like startups that I can tell. There's a couple of companies over here like Mainspring or Bloom Energy or some of those folks who might use a little bit of fossil fuels as input. But like when you look at all the most extraordinary pockets of money and what they're investing in, they're investing on this side of the ledger, right? I mean, all of them, right? Whether it's renewable natural gas or whether it's like the next generation of clean cement or clean steel or whatever it is, like all of that new chemistry that they're doing, you know, like I just looked at the Invent Wood plant up in Frederick, Maryland, which won the ARPA-E award for wood stronger than steel, right? So their wood is like 10 times stronger than steel and it costs half as much to make, and it's like the next generation of sort of, you know, carbon,
building
you know,
materials.
It's amazing, right? Like all of that money is going on this side of the ledger, right? And so the hard part in the past was getting contracts from those 60 energy ministers, and you know, even within the country as well. And that has become way easier because of this crisis.
Bob, capital flows in your side as well. Just thinking about, you know, you talked about the geographies. Are you predominantly seeing this as a Western Hem story now?
Predominantly seen as what?
Western Hemisphere?
Yes, but I think, yes, certainly more towards the Western Hemisphere, but I think there was another structural shift that was gathering pace, and here I'm going to maybe get controversial. We have to bring out the bourbon for Jigar and I. But so I think just before the Iran war ushered in this toppling of a load-bearing assumption and just made us think, and it always will, about the Middle East differently, I think another not quite long-lived load-bearing assumption, maybe a retaining wall that had been built 5 or 6 years ago, collapsed. It was starting to collapse. And that is the, I would assert, consensus view that climate policy, specifically EV mandates and subsidies, were going to so rapidly electrify transportation, destroy, like cause an immediate collapse in gasoline and diesel demand in the OECD now, such that global liquids demand would stop growing in 2030 and then either plateau or fall. Same thing with gas. Again, I assert, go back in the last 5 or 6 years, look at the IEA or just about anybody's oil and gas forecast, and that was what everybody expected. That hadn't been the case for decades before. We normally would assume that a growing, more prosperous world, even in a more efficient economy, would need more oil and gas. But for the last 5 years, 6 years, this idea took hold. A whole other issue, but with the IEA returning to publishing a more realistic, I think, sort of a base case, and I think investors were starting to look at politics since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and say, wow, looks like EV subsidies and mandates are falling in Europe, in China, in Canada, in the United States. Looks like they're not coming on as fast. Looks like energy security. So as a result of that, I think, Landon, everyone would agree that we were not investing, we had not been investing enough in oil and gas to supply a world for which demand would continue to grow after 2030. We were groovy with that as long as we believed demand would peak. But as we realized, as we started to do, I think, at the end of last year, that demand's going to peak, you started to see everybody from BP to investment houses start to shift back from renewables and electrification of transportation back to good old hydrocarbons. And so it's a shift between fuels that now will have this regional component. If you will, two dots. Imagine two structural dots. One, what I call peak demand. The idea that demand will peak itself peaked. The second is the Middle East has a no-kidding security problem nobody thought about at all. It's not a low probability, a high impact event. It was a zero, I've never thought about it. Though, connect those two dots, put an arrowhead on the end of that line that you've made, and it points to North America, South America, Africa, and other places for hydrocarbons.
Let's close this conversation out about policy. I think one of the challenges for industry and for actual policy makers, sitting government officials, is the lack of ability to fully be candid about the best policy that you'd prescribe today. And so, we're looked down to 1600 Penn. What is the best, most consequential energy security policy that the White House could pursue today?
I mean, stop doing dumb things. That'd be a good policy.
Let's be prescriptive.
No, but
you can tell them to back off of a policy. I think that's acceptable. Like, do less of this, or more.
Look, I think the Biden administration, I think, brought back into vogue this concept of industrial policy. And when the Inflation Reduction Act passed, it sent shockwaves around the world, and everyone realized that they needed to do the same thing, right? And, they took their time, but they needed to do the same thing. When you look at the OBBBA, the OBBBA basically left all of the Biden industrial policy pieces in place, right? It got rid of residential subsidies, right? So electric vehicle subsidies or heat pump subsidies. And it phased out solar and wind tax credits, but it left in place 45X. It left in place all of those mechanisms that we need to really be able to get America building again, right? And so I think that the level of policy, sort of stability between those two administrations around onshoring and reshoring has actually been quite good. And you see battery manufacturing and lots of other stuff happening in the United States as a result. I think the bigger problem is that when you think about the most gnarly issues that we have on the supply chain side, whether it's critical minerals or whether it's building new nuclear in the United States, et cetera, there is a level of precision required between government policy and the private sector in those areas that does not exist today.
If I was to take those comments and put them into ChatGPT and say, summarize this in 3 words, are you saying decarbonize the U.S. energy system? Decarbonize U.S. manufacturing?
But remember, if you just ChatGPT everything I said while I was during a Biden...
We'll write this piece
after.
I
was in the Biden administration, I don't think I ever used the word climate or decarbonization, right? My phrase was always, help America do big things again, right? And I think that has always been what's driven me, right? Is I think we have the best entrepreneurs and R&D and all that stuff in the world, and we squandered it for years because we gave them the business card of your guy in Shanghai and said, go over there and build it, right? Today, we're saying, no, do it here. But when you think about the fact that the graphite processing in Louisiana comes from Mozambique, right? That requires coordination with the U.S. State Department. Right? It requires all of these pieces to go into place to be able to get the contracts that you need to do to get this done on the other side, right? And that today is not being done. There's just a lot of just excess masculine energy being put into the world through press releases and this and that, but that does not make precision public-private partnerships.
All right, Bob, we bought you a little time, so you're on the policy spot now.
Well, I will start with the observation. I learned this in the White House. I don't know if you're counted it in government, and I had no idea, but half at least of good policy making is avoiding bad policy making. Stopping stupid
You congruent on
ideas
this.
is something.
I told you, the doctrine is never disagree with Bob.
And so that's number one. The second thing I would say, to end on a high and bipartisan note, I think by far the best example of successful bipartisan energy policy we've seen was the decision by President Obama and the Republican Congress to remove the biggest policy threat to the shale oil and shale gas boom, which is paying us so much dividends right now, and that is by getting rid of the export ban. So if we connect those two ideas, we should resist, both parties will be tempted to undo that progress and resort to export restrictions. It could be because of a horrific price spike in gasoline and diesel later this year. It could be because a Democratic administration comes back and says, monkey see, monkey do, energy climate emergency until we have this or that investment in renewables, we're going to restrict LNG exports, what have you. So I'm concerned that in the Biden administration toward the end, and although I know the Secretary of Energy was here and I know he understands it's deeply unwise. I know there are folks who understand it's deeply unwise, but there will be a temptation if oil prices spike to restrict exports by some. And so I hope both parties resist that, both parties maintain that progress that we made so many years ago.
And I'll draw on a final observation from both of your comments was the need for continuity and consistency in policymaking across parties. So I appreciate both of you. I think we should make this an annual outing, and I will serve bourbon to everybody here next time. Gentlemen, I also want to thank the audience. You went a little bit long, but I took the liberty of it being my forum and the fact that it's the end of the day. So this is, in fact, the last of day one of the Global Energy Forum. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Jigar, for joining us. And thank you all in the audience for sticking it out. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow for another full day of conversations. Have a great day.
Thank you.